Welcome to Historical Context of the Bible. I'm Gary Beasley. I'm here to teach you what I know. Like all these classes, I've always tried to be prepared to give an answer when people ask me why I believe what I believe, and to do that I had to do a lot of learning. Out of that learning, I'm able to give a lot of answers now, and I'm just passing that on to you guys. That's what all of these classes have been about. We've been doing them all year since March, 2 a month. This is going to be a lot of fun. This is one of my favorites. I could do this blindfolded. I'm not sure I could do it upside down, but I'd be willing to give it a try. So what I have up on the board right now is the basic biblical timeline. There are two timelines based on which text we have. Now for the Old Testament we have three, most of you, this is a review for most of us. We have three different texts that we use as the main text when we're translating the Old Testament. We have the Masoretic text, which is the youngest of the text. It was collated in the 900s AD, which is after Christ, by Jewish families. It is the Jewish text. Then we have the Septuagint. The Septuagint was put together 150 to 200 years before Christ, so that's BC. And what the Septuagint was a translation done from the Hebrew to the Greek in Alexandria, Egypt. It was done by 70 Jewish scholars. It's sometimes called the 70 or the Septuagint, Sept being the Greek beginning for 7. It's written up here as LXX. That is the most common way you will see it, which is the Roman numeral 70. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 1940s. They are the oldest text we have. And whenever there's a disagreement between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, we always go, now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can go to the Dead Sea Scrolls as a tiebreaker. Now, people will tell you that according to the Bible, the earth is 6,000 years old. Hi guys, we got cookies in the back and paper if you need to take notes. There's pens and pencils up here. For some reason, they're not in the back of the seats today. There might be some right there too. They'll tell you the earth is 6,000 years old based off the Bible. What that does is it starts with the begats. You know the begats, like in Genesis and Leviticus and whatnot. Bob begat Steve, Steve begat Ralph, Ralph begat Carl, and it says, when Bob was 150 years old, he begat Steve. When Steve was 227, he begat Ralph. When Ralph was 36 years old, he begat, what was the other name I used? Carl? Yeah. They use names I can't pronounce too easily, so I'm using, substitutes. So going through that, you can get back to 6,000 years using the Masoretic text. Now the numbers are slightly different between the creation and the flood, between the flood and Abraham in the Septuagint. And I can go into the reasons why, but that really diverts from what we're studying today. It goes back to why the Jews decided to change these texts between 200 BC and 900 AD. And it has to do with Jewish-Christian relations and Melchizedek, and it's very interesting, and if you want to ask me about it after class, I'd be happy to tell you. The Septuagint is 8,000 years old. Now if you notice, there's roughly 500 years between Abraham and the Exodus, 500 between the Exodus and King David in the time of Kings. There's roughly 500 years of Kings before the exile. There's roughly 500 years of time between the exile and Christ. These are rough numbers. They are not exact by any stretch of the imagination. But up here, there is a difference of 650 years between the flood and Abraham in the Septuagint from the Masoretic. And there is a difference of, I want to say that's 1350 years between the flood and the beginning of creation in the Septuagint and the Masoretic. Okay? That makes the Septuagint says the world is 8,000 years old. If you're here for my creation class, you know that that's the one I favor because, I said we go to the Dead Sea Scrolls for a tiebreaker. Guess what the Dead Sea Scrolls agreed with? The Septuagint. It means the Masoretic is probably wrong on these numbers. This also helps. The Septuagint is what we're going to be using for today because the Septuagint, actually, the timeline of this extra 650 years explains a lot when dealing with other cultures and their histories. Okay. But we're not there yet. But you guys, you can write this down. You need to know we're using the Septuagint, we're using the 8,000-year-old age, and we're using the 650 extra years in between Abraham and the flood, going backwards. All right? Everybody got that? There There is no eraser up here. I'm going to need tissue. One second here. Oh, I got it right here.
Okay.
I'm already here. Okay. So, my original plan for this class was to just go through as much history as I could this week, and as much history as I could next week, and hopefully cover the entire Old Testament with you guys. The class in November, I'm going to be doing the history of the church from Christ to today. That's 1,000 years per class. There's not any major controversies I have to handle there. October, I'm doing the occult. Last two Tuesdays in October, the 30th and the 7 days before that would be what, the 23rd? So right before Halloween, we're doing the occult and modern day occult. Anyway, there's a big controversy here. People will tell you that from what we've dug up from archaeology, the Bible could not have happened. The events of the Old Testament could not have happened. That the oldest event we can date is the creation of the temple in 967 or 966, roughly, BC. Okay, that's what they'll tell you. That's the earliest we can go, and we can only go that. We're only willing to go that far, not because there's a record of it being built then, but because there's a record of the temple in history. We know that the temple was built. There's no question of that. And Jews said it was in 966, 967, so we'll give it to them. Well, there's a good reason why archaeology has gotten to that point, and we're going to go through that. And they really need. Hi, we have cookies in the back by Joe, and paper if you want to take notes. And I'm going to cover this for you 2, 3 real quick. Okay. There's a difference in the timeline between the Masoretic and the Septuagint text. The Masoretic and the Septuagint text were our two main versions of the Old Testament text that we drew from. We know the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't do any tiebreakers. Some of you have heard this before. All the rest of the classes just heard this. There's a difference in the dates. There's an additional 650 years between Abraham and the flood. That extra 650 years is very important. That's really the bare bones of what I said before. Does anyone need this before I erase it? Okay. Are you still taking notes? You're still right now. You need any more of this?
I took a picture.
All right. Good job. So, archaeology. When did archaeology start? What is archaeology? Why is it important? Most of you have a rough idea of what archaeology is. I only really have a rough idea of what it is. It's digging in the dirt to find out about older civilizations and what they left behind in the dirt for us. Archaeology is born out of the humanism movement and the desire for antiquities from the 15th and 16th century. This comes out of the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. People wanted antiquities. They wanted Roman antiquities and Greek antiquities, but nobody was really digging in the dirt much for them, except for the volcanoes in Pompeii. That's not really archaeology, but that's kind of the roots of archaeology. Archaeology really started in 1798. That's 220 years ago. I like that, because it's not 221, it's not 222, it's 220 years ago, 1798. We know that it was the date it started because it started with Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. He brought 175 scholars with him to study Egypt as they went through Egypt. And they started digging into the dirt, pulling up artifacts and trying to understand the language for the first time. It was during these campaigns that we found the Rosetta Stone. Do you guys, anybody need an explanation? Anyone not hear the Rosetta Stone before? Okay, real quick. We were able to translate hieroglyphics for the first time since Augustus before Christ. Augustus Caesar was the Caesar that was in power when Christ was born. Okay, it was the end of Augustus's reign when Christ was born. His successor, Tiberius Caesar, was the Caesar during most of the Gospels. Okay, that's the last 3 years of Christ's life, his ministry. Tiberius Caesar, Augustus' successor, was the Caesar in charge. So, in 1798, the last person alive who could read hieroglyphics was Augustus Caesar, to the best of our knowledge. Maybe there was somebody else running around, but it was, even at the time, even 2,000 years ago, it was a scholarly pursuit. No one was writing in hieroglyphics anymore. They were using Coptic, which was utilizing the Greek text, but utilizing the Greek alphabet to write Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone had 3 languages on it: Greek, Coptic, and hieroglyphics. And by studying that and translating, so we could read the Greek and we could kind of read the Coptic. And so our scholars studied the Greek and the Coptic to figure out hieroglyphics. We found a few other stones since then. Whenever we find a stone nowadays, a tablet or a translation that has 2 languages on it, and we know one of them, we call it the Rosetta Stone of that culture. So when we found the Hittites, we found the Hittite Rosetta Stone. When we found the Akkadians, we found the Akkadian Rosetta Stone. Does that make sense? So archaeology started in Egypt, okay? This whole conflict between whether or not the Bible can be is true because of archaeology or isn't true of archaeology can be countered with one sentence. Now you need a lot of understanding to explain this sentence, but it's one sentence. If someone asks you why you believe the Bible is true, despite what archaeology says, all you have to say is the Egyptian chronology needs to be redone. The Egyptian chronology needs to be redone, it needs to be reworked. If you say that, somebody who understands and knows archaeology will be like, whoa, okay, the Egyptian chronology needs to be reworked. Got it. I see all of the arguments you're about to present. But most of us have no idea what that means. So because archaeology started in Egypt, we have more stuff pulled out of the dirt from Egypt than any other culture. Most of the places, like the Valley of the Kings, where we found King Tut's tomb, was a valley way outside of civilization for over 200 years. We have more information about Egypt. We have so much information, we almost have too much. And Egyptian was the first ancient language we were able to translate because of the Rosetta Stone. It was the first stone we found like that. So the Egyptian chronology is the chronology that we measure all other cultures by. So when I say chronology, imagine it as a timeline. So we just had up the dates here, but as a timeline, so you've got the Egyptian timeline, and this board is jumping, E, G, Y, P, T. You've got the Israeli timeline. You've got, say, the Babylonian, the Assyrian timeline. You've got Babylon, the Hittites. And so you list the events. So you've got, event A. Let's say it's the Battle of Kadesh. So if the Battle of Kadesh matches up on the Hittites and the Egyptian timeline here, then you find all these different dates and you find another event. And they don't always match up perfectly. You might have B over here and B here. But what you do is you find all these different events on the timelines. And whichever 2 timelines can match together, so this is called the chronology or timeline. You match up those chronologies together. So you can date each other's history and what they say about their history based off of the common events. Like when Egypt went to war with the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, that was a huge event in both timelines. We can take that and match up the chronologies from there. Okay. When the Hittites retake the city of Aleppo which was just in the news, Aleppo, this year or last year, I forget. When they retook Aleppo from the Mitanni, then you could match up the Hittite and the Mitanni timelines based off of that event. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay. So Egypt, as we go through Egypt, we have the most complete study of Egypt. We have the most complete timeline of Egypt. We have more information on Egypt than anyone else. So we've had the Bible with us since, the days of the Apostolic Fathers, right after Christ. We've had the complete Bible since the Apostolic Fathers, since say 100 AD. We had the New Testament and the Old Testament. We had the entire Old Testament was finished probably 400 years before Christ. Okay, so we've had that, and it is a record. But the problem with that, okay, I'm doing this a little wrong. First time through explaining this to somebody. Everything that we pull out of the earth or document that we found, we assign a weight to it. And by weight, I mean, I like to use that term because the heavier something is, the better it supports your argument. The better it holds your argument down, the better it can hold your argument up. So using the term weight kind of metaphorically here, every document, everything we pull out of the ground has a certain weight. And weight is assigned subjectively. You get to choose it for yourself how much weight you're going to give to each document. And each historian, each archaeologist gets to assign how much weight they want to give it. But the standards we use for weight are the same. How close is it to the actual event, time-wise? How close was the person to the event? Were they a witness, or did they get their information from witnesses? Or are they a third or fourth or fifth party witness to it? Like, I heard it from a friend who, heard it from a friend who, heard it from a friend you were messing around. So that's the first two categories of weight. And then there's the category of trust. What is the bias of this person who is giving you this story? Like, why are they telling you this story? What does it mean to them? How does their worldview influence that? Does that make sense for weight categories? Okay, good. So they actually say that before Herodotus, there was no history, because Herodotus is the first unbiased historian. He didn't have a dog in the fight for most of what he was writing about. Herodotus was a Greek. He mostly wrote about other cultures, not Greek cultures. When he does write about Greek cultures, the Greeks always turn out the best, so he does have a bias. But most of his histories, which, by the way, I highly recommend. There's some great translations out there on the web you can read for free. Herodotus, his histories. He talks like a fun uncle telling stories at Christmas. It's great. And it's spelled hero.us. Hero.us. Herodotus. Okay, very easy. I could write it up there if anybody has a problem with that. So before that, they say that it wasn't really history, it was propaganda. And that is definitely true of the Egyptians. The Egyptians, as we're going to find out as we study the 18th dynasty today, the Egyptians, when they didn't like a part of their history, would erase it to the best of their abilities. Okay. So when we started with archaeology in 1798, from there, we started finding discrepancies. Okay. We started finding discrepancies between the Egyptian chronology and the Israeli chronology. Okay. And when we found those discrepancies, the archaeologists had two choices at that point. Do we trust the Hebrews, or do we trust the Egyptians? Now, the Egyptians had a lot more weight. Their stuff wasn't copies of copies of copies handed down, scrupulously copied, I'll grant you that, by scribes and clerics. And scholars and whatnot, they had the actual, they're pulling out of the ground the actual monuments that the Egyptians themselves, that the pharaohs themselves usually commissioned during their own lifetime, or the very next pharaoh would commission it for the previous pharaoh's successes and events. So weight-wise, it's right next to the event. I mean, this is an original event. It's written down by official historians of the time for the kingdom. But the bias is all pro-Egypt. So that's an issue to take into consideration. Now, the other problem with getting these timelines together is there is no birth of Christ yet. Everybody in the world, whether they use BC and AD or BCE and CE, every timeline that's established today, every calendar in the entire world uses the birth of Christ as the midpoint. Everything previous to the birth of Christ leads up to it. Everything after the birth of Christ is dated after it. Okay? We went to this around the year 300 in the Roman Empire. Because of European conquest of the world, everyone has taken our timeline based off of the birth of Christ. It's a few years off, actually. Christ was probably not born in 0 AD. Or 0 BC, it's the same year. In fact, it's not BC or AD, it's just 0. And it wasn't a year, it was 1 BC, and then at the end of 1 BC, you have the 0 point, and then it's 1 AD after that. There is no year 0. 0 means nothing. There is no nothing year. So, everybody was using timelines up until around the year 300 under the Roman Empire. Everybody was using timelines based off of events, usually installation of a new king. If you read through the Book of Kings, and especially, Book of 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Bible, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Every time a new king comes in, it says, in the year of King Ralph of Israel, in his 15th year, King Bob in Judah came to the throne. So they're dating what's going on in Judah based off of the events in Israel. And that's how all date systems work. It was the 15th year of Steve's reign. It was the 15th year of Jane's reign. Every once in a while we get a female in there. It's the 15th year of Clarence's reign. Okay, it's just based off of that. So we have problems with the dates. We have to find points in common and try and get those dates right. And then people use different measurements for years. Some people were using solar years, especially the people from Mesopotamia, who were great astronomers. And the Egyptians and the Israelites were often using, and other cultures in the Mediterranean and the Levant, they were using lunar years. Okay? So we've got to match all this up. So before we get into all these before we even started digging at other places, we had the Egyptian chronology and the Israelite chronology, and that was it for the Middle East. Yeah, we had the Greeks and we had the Romans, but they had very little impact until Alexander the Great. Well, actually, it was really. Did you guys see the movie 300? Yeah, it was very violent, pretty historically accurate, not perfect by any stretch, very Hollywoodized. But the events itself, Xerxes was coming in, and Leonidas and the boys opposed him. That is the first major impact the Greeks had on Mediterranean culture, except for, of course, the Battle of Troy, but that had very little impact itself, except on the Hittites. And that was thousands of years earlier, or about 1,000 years earlier. So the Greeks and the Romans aren't helping us try and figure out the chronology of the Middle East. Egypt and Israel is all we have at this point. So you have to choose between Egypt and Israel. For the reasons I've outlined for weight, they chose Egypt. They were wrong. We didn't know they were wrong. Egypt has a lot of gaps in it. Egypt has a very big problem with their dynasties. You guys have heard of Upper and Lower Egypt? I like to use Northern and Southern because Upper Egypt is in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north. It is determined by the flow of the Nile. The Nile is one of the only major rivers in the world that flows north instead of south. Even the Amazon, which flows mostly east, flows east and south. Don't know why. Ask God. He's the one who formed the world the way it is today. But Egypt goes north. So Upper Egypt is down, Lower Egypt is up. So I'm going to try and use Northern and Southern Egypt just to not confuse things. So they have a lot of problems with the chronology because they have two different kingdoms they're trying to establish chronology with. And on top of that, I need to turn off notifications on this. And I'm about to get an alarm anyway. Give me 1 second here. Alarms. Okay. Chronology, Northern and Southern Egypt. Manetho. There was an Egyptian scribe named Manetho. And where's my right stick? M-E-N-E-T. Wasn't there. He wrote a list, and we don't have his writings, we have Josephus' writings. Josephus saw Manetho's writings and recorded them. Manetho has a king's list. He wrote a list of all the pharaohs of Egypt. And he wrote down the length of their reign, not the dates. Again, there's no absolute BC AD point to these lengths by, or dates by. He wrote down the lengths of their reigns. Egypt, according to, and if you stack them one after the other, you have Egypt lasting for like 10,000 years. So everybody knows that you can't use that for that. But we use it anyway, because it's one of the very first things we ever had for the chronology of Egypt. We still use that list far too much. Now, one of the problems with Manetho's king's list is that both southern and northern pharaohs are on there. So if I've got two pharaohs reigning at the same time, I've got a whole bunch of years that I have problems with because I'm doubling the number of years on there. Another issue that started occurring with the 18th dynasty, which is a long, long time ago, is that the pharaohs figured out that every time a pharaoh dies, all of their vassal states rebel. So they needed to establish continuity between the pharaohs. So, if Bob is pharaoh and his son Steve is coming up as the next pharaoh, this is the crown prince, Steve the crown prince. As soon as Bob felt that Steve was ready to rule, even though he hasn't retired yet, he would crown him pharaoh, and they would reign at the same time. So that when Bob goes ahead and dies, poor Bob, when Bob dies, Steve takes over, and there's no break in continuity, so there's no reason for vassal states to rebel. Make sense? Smart thing to do. But it messes up Manetho's kings list even more, because now not only do we have northern and southern kings together, we have kings reigning at the same time, and we don't have any dates, we just have the length of their reign. So the Egyptian chronology, for those reasons, needs to be redone, needs to be reworked. But even more than that, after Egypt, well, during Egypt really, after we're digging in Egypt in 1798, we start digging in other places. We found the Assyrian Empire in Nineveh. We found Nineveh. We found the Assyrian Empire. We found ancient Babylon. We found their empire. We're digging all their stuff up out of the ground. We eventually found the Hittites. They were the last ones to join the party. In fact, we didn't believe Hittites existed until we found the Hittites. I want to say it was 50 to 70 years ago we finally did the dig that found the Hittites. To the point that Karl Barth made a very famous statement that one of the reasons he believes in the Bible is because he has never met a Hittite in New York City, but he's met plenty of Israelites. Hittites didn't even exist. I don't know if Karl Barth was alive when we finally found them. They did exist, I'm sorry. It was not believed that the Hittites existed until we dug them out of the ground. Does that make sense? So as we go through all these different chronologies of Assyria and Babylon and Media Persia and all these, and the Hittites and the Mitanni and all these different civilizations that we're pulling out of the ground through archaeology, what we're finding is that the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Mitanni and the Medians and the Persians and the Kassites and the Babylonians and all these different, and every time I say that I think where they are on the map. I could bring the map up and start pointing as I'm talking. All of these different civilizations, all of their points, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatnot, all of their historical points match up pretty well together. It's not perfect. They match up pretty well together. And then here's Egypt out here going, hi, I'm doing things different. Their points are all over the place. And a lot of that goes back to the King's List and the way they did chronology. We still have a lot more information about Egypt than probably any of the other cultures, probably all the rest of the cultures put together. We have a lot of Egyptian information. They didn't own Egypt. Napoleon came in and took Egypt, and Egypt didn't get Egypt back until the end of World War I. So from 1798 to 1919, whatever it was, right in that time period, Egypt was not owned by Egypt. It was owned by various European nations. It was a colony. So we could dig wherever we wanted, like I was there. Like America ever owned Egypt. We never owned Egypt. So they could dig wherever they wanted to. So we've got tons of Egypt stuff. But again, their chronology does not match up. Now there's a video out there, a documentary, that I highly recommend. It was on Netflix, it's not anymore. It's called Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. Does anybody want me to write that down? Yes, no, nod, no. Nobody's nodding, I'm not going to write it down, but I'll repeat it a few times. Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. They're looking to do a whole series. Kevin Sorbo did the narration for this. It is an excellent documentary. When it was on Netflix, I watched it maybe 10 times. It covers this controversy, and the Egyptian controversy, through the eyes of someone who dealt with it themselves. Okay, they came at it honestly. They wanted to understand, is the history of the Bible accurate or not? And it covers why the Egyptian chronology needs to be redone. They do an excellent job. Does every scholar think it was the greatest job ever? No. Every scholar is going to nitpick through anything they don't agree with. That's what scholars do. It's why they're scholars. And we're thankful for it. We want them to do that. We want to know the controversy. We want to know the problems. So we can be informed. Because we're pulling this stuff out of the dirt. The earliest stuff from Egypt that we're pulling out is 2,000 years old. Yeah, we're not going to get everything. We know we're not going to get everything. We know that going in. So that's the issue. That's the controversy. Again, the strongest argument is that the Bible lines up with all of the, as long as it's the Septuagint, with those extra 650 years we were talking about, the Bible lines up better with the other chronologies of the time. The other chronologies of the time line up better with each other. Egypt is the outlier for all of this. We're thankful for Egypt, we're thankful for the scholars, we're thankful that they went ahead and made that wrong decision to put more weight on Egypt than Israel. It was the right decision at the time, it was the decision I probably would have made, and I would have said, okay, so this presents a very different argument. This is a stronger argument right now than the Bible. I still believe the Bible is true, I think this is wrong, but this is definitely the stronger argument right now. And it's not the stronger argument anymore. Now the problem is, and this is a problem endemic. This is a problem every form of scholarship has, okay? It's part of every kind of, physicists have, physicists, chemists, historians, sociologists, sports analysts have this problem. And this is the problem. Geeks especially. Geeks are arguing about like sci-fi and stuff. They always deal with this. An opinion that you were taught about history or whatever your subject is at a very young age is an opinion you will hold until you are forced to challenge it or force yourself to challenge it. And if you're not willing to force yourself to challenge it, you will continue to hold that opinion. And if somebody presents you with an opposite opinion and you don't want to challenge it, you won't challenge it. No, this is true, this has been true. I got somebody who still is arguing about Homo erectus, were they human or not? And they were human. We've done DNA tests. There's no doubt Homo erectus was human. I get into arguments about whether or not they were human or whether they were apes, pre-human ancestors. And I'm like, I can't do anything more than tell you go look at the data again and make a decision for yourself. But this is, what ends up happening is a paradigm is a belief system that everybody holds on to for, it's kind of like a worldview. Paradigms shift, and when they do, you gotta change everything. So a paradigm is established in a field of study. That's really what we're talking about here. And this paradigm for Egypt being the chronology, the main chronology we use, will not shift until, and this is again something we see throughout academia, the paradigm will not shift until the current people who hold that paradigm, the elders, the guys in charge of the university, the guys with the most tenure, until they die, and that's kind of gruesome and morbid, but it's true, until they pass on, hopefully peacefully. I'm not wishing anyone to die here in a violent means or even in a non-violent means, but until they pass on or retire, their view is going to be the main paradigm in the culture of that academic circle, in that field of study. And we find that most paradigm shifts happen as each generation, as different generations come forward and take over the field of study. So we may be seeing, because the evidence is overwhelming, that the Egyptian chronology needs to be revised. We may be seeing a change in that forward going. Like in the next 10, 20 years, hopefully we will see the Egyptian chronology. Finally, there will be enough scholars who will say, because right now there are scholars, advanced scholars, high up there, but there's still a minority in the top of their field saying, no, the Egyptian chronology is wrong. It needs to be revised. And until that happens, you're going to have problems. Now there's another issue. There's another issue with the Bible and the Exodus in particular. And that is that the Israelites lived in the town of Ramesses. Okay. In the Bible, in Genesis and Exodus, it said that when Joseph was in Egypt, the Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen and the city of Ramesses. Okay. The argument from historians is that there would never be a town named Ramesses until there was a Pharaoh named Ramesses. This is a very, very weak argument, and I'm going to destroy it for you right now. I'm going to do it very easily. Ramesses means son of Ra. No pharaoh was named Ramesses until the 19th dynasty. The one right after this. In fact, he's the first pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, after the 18th dynasty. His grandson, I believe it went Ramesses Seti Ramesses II. Doesn't matter. Ramesses meant son of Ra. Ramesses, the word, can be found in hieroglyphics dating back over 1,000 years before the reign of Ramesses I. It means son of Ra. Every single crowned prince had the title Ramesses. Every single crowned prince. It wasn't his main title, but it was one of his titles because he was the son of Ra. Every pharaoh was considered Ra, Every crown prince was therefore the son of Ra. What? Town named after his crown prince. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the world, he named more towns after his horse, Bucephalus, than he did. He'd conquer a city and he'd rename it. So most of the cities, the most popular renaming name was Alexandria, named after himself. The second most popular name was Bucephalus, named after his horse. The third most popular name was named after his favorite attack dog. After that, a couple of generals got a couple of towns. Wasn't that nice of them? It's like 37 or something towns and cities named Bucephalus. Bucephalus! It's his horse! Anyway, it's not hard, bearing that in mind, for us to believe that the Egyptians would name a town after every crown prince in the Egyptian and all the dynasties. Okay? So that's the controversy. Took me about 40 minutes. Any questions on the controversy before I go forward? No. Oh, one more thing. Ramesses II, who was, again, 2 generations after Ramesses I, fought the Israelites. We actually have it's called the Israel Stela, which is like the worst name ever for it. But it's the conquest of all the things that Ramesses II did. And one of the things he did was he claimed to have conquered Israel. For him to claim to have conquered Israel, Israel had to have been an established nation at the time. All the events of the Exodus and the establishment of Israel, there's no way it could have been formed in 20 odd years from after Ramesses I, before Ramesses, it's less than 20 years if I remember correctly, after Ramesses I and before Ramesses II. For Israel to form a nation in that short period of time it's not believable. So that's another problem with the whole Ramesses argument, for the Exodus being under Ramesses. All right, can we go to the maps? Because we're not quite at the 18th dynasty yet. Okay, so let's take this up here. Mountains of Ararat are up here. See this mountainous region up here? That is where they say, that is the most common place for where the ark landed, was the mountains of Ararat. It could have been there. We don't know. We've never found the ark. It was 6,000, it was 4 and 2, that's 6, plus 650, it was 6,650 odd years ago, plus 18, because I'm dating this on round numbers off the year 2000. So, what is that, 6,668 odd years ago when it landed. It was made out of wood. Really good chance it rotted by now. Really good chance it rotted long before now. Really good chance it rotted within the first 1,000 years. Stuff around me rots, stuff in my place. I dropped some pine trees last year. They're going. They cured, and now they're starting to go, which is good. Now I don't have to move them out of my yard. So from there, life arguably moved out in different directions. As we read through Genesis, I believe it's Genesis 10 or Genesis 11, the table of nations. It talks about all the different nations, but it's 10 or 11. We go through and we see the spreading of nations. There's some really good videos on YouTube, and I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, where he talks about where he's gone through, this one guy has gone through, I did it in a different class here, I showed him for like a minute. Ask me after class and we'll find it, but he has gone through all of these ancient texts and found where these different tribes that are named in the Genesis come from. And one of the sons of Canaan was Sin, and he says that is the ancestors of the Chinese, because the Chinese are known as the Sino, S-I-N-O. Like the Chinese-Japanese War around the time of World War I or before it, I forget off the top of my head, but we can look it up. It was called the Sino-Japanese War, and that the ancient name for the Chinese people derives from that word, from a similar sounding word, because again, at Babel, all the languages were changed, and that's recorded in a variety of different cultures, but we're going past Babel now, okay? They say the best bet for Babel is down here in Kuwait. There's an unfinished temple that the Babylonians, that actually Nebuchadnezzar, who was thousands of years after the whole Babylonian thing, during the time of Daniel, during the exile, they say that he found this temple and he started to rebuild it and he claimed that it was from it. And it kind of matches this unfinished story from the book of Genesis on Babel. But the problem is, the Tower of Babel was made with brick, and this wasn't made with brick, it was made with stone. So maybe it's not there. We don't know. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this class. So after Babylon, the next big guy that comes in the Bible is Abraham. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia, which is also right here towards Iraq and Kuwait borderline, between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Euphrates leads all the way up here. It is a very important river for us today. It's only about as long as, I want to say, the Colorado River. I think it's the Colorado. They're about the same length. So this distance here is not something Abraham couldn't have walked. Abraham's path. See how there's kind of a desert here, a little bit of a desert. Not a lot of people live here. So we call this the Fertile Crescent because it's fertile all the way up and down like a crescent. See? An arc? Yeah. So the only way, one of the reasons Israel is such an important, it's a tiny little piece of the world. It's this big. It's right there. That's the Sea of Galilee, and that's the Dead Sea right there. So this little land right here, that's Israel. Tiny little stretch of land. It's about the size of New Jersey. But it's incredibly important because if you're traveling by land, it's the only way to get from the breadbasket of the world, Egypt, out to the rest of the world. What is modern-day Turkey, Iraq, even up to Georgia. Egypt was the biggest breadbasket of the world. The Nile flooded. Egypt doesn't get a lot of rain to this day, even back then. So because of that, the Nile flooding is what watered their crops. They built irrigation canals. That's where Archimedes made the water screw, invented the screw, and changed the world. Very interesting study. That was thousands of years later, though. Egypt is the breadbasket of the world. They consistently produce crops. And we see this in Abraham's story. Abraham, after he gets all the way over here to Israel, there's a drought or a famine or whatever it was. Where does he go? Breadbasket of the world, Egypt. They always have crops in Egypt because they don't depend on rain. They depend on the Nile flooding. The Nile is the lifeblood. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile by Herodotus. If I remember, I think it was Herodotus. So, have you guys ever heard of Hammurabi? Hammurabi's Law Code. I'm only getting a couple of nods. Hammurabi's Law Code was arguably the first constitution or set of laws. It is the oldest one we have ever found. Hammurabi lived around the time of Abraham, a couple hundred years, give or take. And he created a law code that everyone had to follow. Now there's a class system inside this law code. It is not everybody's equal by any stretch of the imagination. But the phrase an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes from the Hammurabi law code. It's also in the Bible. But Moses wrote Leviticus where that is. And that was over 1,000 years after Hammurabi. So, or about 1,000 years. 1400s, well, more than, not 1,000 years, but a couple hundred years. Hammurabi, the Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi ended in right around the year 1600. It was like 1598 BC. So, the Exodus, according to the Israeli timeline, would have happened around either 1446 or 1406. There's a 40-year difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. And the Septuagint says it was 440 years in 1 Kings 6:1. That's 1 Kings 6:1. He said it's 440 years. The Masoretic text says it's 480 years. It's a 40-year difference. There's all sorts of reasons for that, but we're not there yet. Can I go to the other map, please? Map of history. We're going to be jumping back and forth between these two. So, the biggest cities in the Middle Bronze period, in the Levant. Now, that's not just Israel. That's That's all the Fertile Crescent along the Mediterranean. Okay, that's the Levant. It means different things, that's the way we're using the term. But out of all of the Mediterranean, the biggest cities of that time period, of that Middle or Late Bronze period, I forget how they classify it exactly, were Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the Jordan. We have found them thanks to Dr. Stephen Collins. Now, if you Google Stephen Collins, I will guarantee you that you will get the actor who played the father on Seventh Heaven. But if you Google Stephen Collins and Sodom, you'll get Dr. Stephen Collins. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this. A lot of people want to put the Sodom and Gomorrah, which the story of Sodom and Gomorrah originates in the Bible. There is no older source for the existence of Sodom and Gomorrah than the Bible. And it has the dealings with Abraham and Lot. Are you all familiar enough with this story for me not to have to explain it? Thanks. Most people put it at the bottom end of the Dead Sea. And they had good reason for that. Back in 18 something or other, they had dug up some cities, some areas north of the Dead Sea where the Bible says Sodom was. Go to Genesis 13, it describes where Sodom was. One of the things calls them the cities of the Jordan. It calls, they're on the circle of the Jordan. The word there is circle, not plains. Okay, this is, in Genesis 13 is the only time the word Kikar, K-I-K-A-R, is translated as plains. It's usually translated as tortilla, coin, or just circle. Talent. There's a talent coin that was called the Kikar. There's a round piece of bread, which could be called tortilla. It's pretty much similar to that. That was also called a Kikar because it looked like a circle. And the talent looked like a circle. And Kikar is the Israeli word for circle. Ellis Island, where instead of saying, if you couldn't write your name in English, you had to make a cross. Jews wouldn't make a cross, they would make a circle. So the people at Ellis Island bringing in the Jews would learn the word keikel from the Yiddish and say keikel, keikel. And it got shortened to kike. Kike is a very offensive word. I do not recommend using it if you're not familiar with it. It's pretty much the most offensive thing you can call a Jewish person. Okay? Don't use it. But now you know where it came from. It wasn't an insult to begin with, but it became an insult because that's what you would call them to insult over time. Does that make sense? All right. Again, don't use kike. So they're doing excavations in the 1800s, and they're not finding Sodom and Gomorrah in this area. So they guessed it must have been down here. There's also two towns called Zoar, close, that could be translated as Zoar, which is the town that Lot escaped to, if you remember the story. One is up here, one is down here. Sodom and Gomorrah are here. They're in the country of Jordan. They're on the other side of the Jordan. Stephen Collins has found them. They're the largest cities from that Bronze Age period in the whole Levant, bigger than this map. Okay? There's no bigger cities than the cities that he has found in his dig in the country of Jordan. They are huge. They are not mentioned in any text except the Bible, which, again, texts are just what we pull out of the ground, so we may just not have it. But they're not mentioned in any text before the Bible, and when they are mentioned in other texts by like Strabo or whatever his name was, he's doing it as a response to having been down to Israel hundreds and hundreds of years after the Bible, after Moses. He was Greek, straight away. So anyway, they weren't finding anything up here. So they said, well, there's another city named Zoar down here. Maybe the floodplain is down here. Well, right here, across from Jericho, there is a circle plain. It's a flat basin that is in the shape of a circle. According to Genesis, when Sodom and Gomorrah went up, Moses was over here at Bethlehem, about 40 miles away, and he could see the flames from Bethlehem. Well, Bethel at the time, but that's where modern-day Bethlehem is. And he was looking east. There's more descriptors for where, in Genesis 13,
we have all the descriptors for where Sodom and Gomorrah are. There are more descriptors for where the city of Sodom and Gomorrah are in the Bible than any other city in the Bible, including Jerusalem. Jerusalem is number 2 with 25. There's 27 for Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you read the Bible, which is the only text, it's the first text to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, it will tell you where Sodom and Gomorrah were. It's right here. All of the scriptures meet up with it. One of the big problems with it being down here is that it's called the Kaikar of the Jordan, the plain of the Jordan. There's no Jordan River below the Dead Sea. There's no plain of the Jordan below the Red Sea. There's no Jordan River. Why would there be a plain of the Jordan? So it has to be north of the Red Sea based on that one particular descriptor. Stephen Collins has dug there. He has found these giant cities. The giant cities have to be explained. Where did they come from? What were they? How did they get there? The only explanation we have is that they are exactly where the Bible says Sodom and Gomorrah would be. Historical context of the Bible, there's one more that catches up. The more we dig in the earth, the more we find that the Bible is correct. The more we pull out of the earth, the more civilizations we dig up, the more the Bible is proven correct. Time and time and time again. Now we're going to talk about, there's not much more to talk about here except, can we go back to the other map? I'm going to give you a basic lay of the land. This is Egypt. This is northern or lower Egypt and southern or upper Egypt. Okay? This is Canaan at the time. This whole area basically was Canaan. We have Lebanon, Syria. Over here on the Euphrates, right around there, you have Assyria. Assyria. It is the city of Assur. Assyria. Okay? That Assyria over there, huge empire for hundreds of years. Syria, small little nation state. They're easy to confuse because they're spelled exactly the same except for the letter A. Okay? Well, look for that A because Syria at one point owned all that. Now we're not there yet, but eventually, when dealing with the Israelites during the King's period, Assyria owns all of this. That's during the King's period. We're still back with Abraham. So, the nations that we know about. Babylon is in its, it's about to enter, while Abraham is in here, it's about to enter the Kassite period. Syria, this tiny little nation state up here, is going to walk down the Euphrates and sack Babylon and destroy the empire. It's just about to do it while Abraham's alive. Okay? They do not become an empire yet. They're still just a tiny little city of some of the fiercest warriors in history. They just walked down here with their little army. The Babylonian army was significantly bigger. Came down here, sacked Babylon, took whatever they wanted, and left. Something to do. Destroy an entire empire. Something to do. Up here, next to the Assyrians here, we have the Empire of the Mitanni. They are the second most powerful empire in the world at this point. Okay? They're growing into it. By the time of by the time of Moses, Mitanni will be the second most powerful nation in the world. You'll never guess what the most powerful nation is. The third most powerful nation is, so they're splitting up eastern Turkey here. The Hittites are here, the Mitanni are here, and right here is a whole bunch of mountains, which you can kind of see, stopping them from getting access to the Mediterranean. This little piece of land right here, tiny little piece of land, is being fought over by the Hittites and the Mitanni for hundreds of years because it is their access to the Mediterranean. Neither one of them can get to the Mediterranean. The Mitanni are too far inland, and the Hittites have a bunch of mountains in their way. Technically, they own the mountains, but they can't get through them, so what good does that do to them? Then, you've got tiny little city-states. There is no major nation through here at this point. This land is officially traded back and forth between the Egyptians and the Mitanni. Okay? Again, if you thought we didn't know about the Hittites, we didn't discover the Mitanni until we translated the Hittite stuff. And then we went and dug and found the Mitanni. Okay? They are one of the most recently learned about empires. But they were there. and they're going to factor into the period of the judges. So those are the players: Egypt, Hatti, the Hittites, Mitanni, Assyria, tiny little city all by itself, doesn't own anything at this point except its own town. And down here you have the Mesopotamians. Kassites are more builders than conquerors. While they reign for a few hundred years down in Mesopotamia, they're not aggressive. They want to build, they want to trade. So that is the time frame for the nations during Abraham and his sons. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Okay. Abraham goes down to Egypt. He doesn't have very many problems with Pharaoh, though he lies about Sarah and she goes into his harem. You guys remember that story? Yeah. That Pharaoh is the last Pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. We're going to talk about dynasties now, so I'm going to erase this board. Does anybody still need Stephen Collins? No. Good. So, this is fun. We're going to jump from the Exodus. Almost definitely happened during the 18th dynasty, the second half of the 18th dynasty. The end of it really kind of destroyed Egypt. All those plagues really kind of destroyed Egypt. But Abraham was in the 12th dynasty. That's only 400 years between those events. 400, maybe 500 years between those events. That's not a lot of time to go from 12 dynasties to 18 dynasties. From 12 dynasties to 18 dynasties, is it? No. Well, what dynasty means is it is a change of the bloodline for the rulers. Okay. So let's use England for an example, because we were just talking about it. England has had 2 dynasties in its entire existence. 2. It had its first dynasty formed when King, I forget his name off the top of my head, combined the lands in the middle of that island that England is on, because you've got Scotland in the north and Wales in the south and England in the middle. There was the Dane lands, which were owned by the Vikings at the time. There was some Welsh people there, and there was England itself. And they were all England was getting raided like crazy. He joined as many leaders as he could together. He formed England. He conquered the Vikings, took over their and brought their legal structure. America's law system is based more on the Vikings than any other culture. The Vikings had a contract-based law system. This has nothing to do with the topic, but I'm going on rabbit trails, so let's hop along. When Vikings went a Viking, or out to raid, which was what the Assyrian raid on Babylon was, it was just a raid. They went down there, destroyed an empire, and came back. It was something to do. They needed some money. When the Vikings went out a Viking, this is how it worked. I have a boat. I need some strong warriors. Tim, you're a strong warrior. What would it take for you to come with me to go a Viking? I'm going to England. Well, England has sheep. Would you like 10 sheep? No, what I really need, I need 15 sheets of wool. Long 30-foot sheets of wool. Okay, let's write this down. I'm the Viking chief, because I own the boat. You're one of my Viking warriors, because you grew up near me, and let's do this. We would write out a contract, and that contract would be kept. I go to you. What do you need? Okay, you want 12 sheep. What do you need? You need 15 pieces of gold. You need some jewelry for your wife. Okay, what do you need? You need some slaves. Let's all go a Viking together. Their entire system was based off of that contract law. Everything was a contract. Everything got written down. The word thing is from the Nordic languages. It means a gathering of people. When people would get there, it'd be called the all thing. Let's go to the all thing. All things, a lot of things got decided at the all thing. Because everybody was there, all the elders, all the kids, everybody. So, going back to dynasties. That was the first dynasty of England, when he took over the Dane land, took over the rest of the land, combined it into one country, and a few hundred years later, you have a question. What?
Was that a King Alfred?
Yes!
Yeah.
It was Alvin. Yes, King Alvin. Yes. Might have been Alfred. No, I think it was Alvin. Doesn't matter, we can look it up. It was something like that. It started with an A. It wasn't Arthur, though. So he goes through until Edward the, whatever his title was, he dies. He had promised William the Conqueror that he would give him, William the Conqueror wasn't called the Conqueror yet. He was still called William the Bastard because his parents weren't married. Well, he was continued to call, I'm serious. He was continued to be called that after, I remember him, this is a little obscene. I apologize. I remember him from, I learned about him in elementary school. I never forgot him because one of my classmates called him Billy the Bastard. I'm not saying we should call him that, but man, that stuck with me for the last 20 years. 30 years. So, anyway, he promised William of Normandy, who would become known as William the Conqueror, he promised him that he would be his successor. Edward had no sons or daughters. The English didn't want William. William went to the Pope. This is 1066. He got permission, and he got permission from the Pope to invade England and take it over, which he proceeded to do. This is an amazingly and interesting part of history, and I'm not going to cover any more of it than this. From 1066 to the present day, the English have never been conquered. The English have only had one bloodline from that point. They've had different houses, and a house happens when there's only a female to take over the throne, and she marries a male from another house. But the bloodline continues through the female. If we're using dynasty in the same way we're going to use it for the Egyptians, then that counts as the same dynasty. There's been one dynasty in England. Lots of houses, one dynasty for the last 1,000-odd years. Okay. Egypt, they got lots of dynasties. It's happening all the time, especially in this time period. Abraham probably came in at the end of the 12th dynasty. The 12th dynasty was a joined dynasty. I want to say it was Sennacherib III. No, it wasn't Sennacherib. That was an Assyrian. I forget what his name is off the top of my head. He was probably the last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. He ruled both northern and southern England. After that, the Hyksos came in. The Hyksos are probably Amorites. They were invaders. The word in Egypt is the word that the Greeks used when they translated to Egypt was Hyksos. That's the word we use. Hyksos, they ruled for a couple hundred years. Okay. The Hyksos constitute the 13th, 14th, 15th, and there's a reason I'm writing it this way, 16th, 17th dynasties. Now, in Lower Egypt in the north, you have the Hyksos ruling for the 13th and 14th dynasties. In southern Egypt, you have Egyptians ruling for 3 dynasties. Now remember, a dynasty just means it's not a set period of time. It means the family that's ruling has changed. It's no longer descendants of the same king who started the dynasty. So this is only a period of a few hundred years, but you have 5 dynasties. Okay? Because you have 2 countries. You have 3 dynasties in one country, 2 dynasties in another country. Same Egypt. At the end of the 17th dynasty, which is only a couple of kings, they get together, they pool all their power in the south, and they kick the Hyksos out of the north, and they recombine the dynasty into a joint dynasty, the 18th dynasty. I'm sorry, they recombine the nations into one nation. At the end of the 17th dynasty, the 18th is joined again. This is called an intermediate period, because they're not together. Anytime that Egypt is not together, it's an intermediate period. You'll also find that in China in the 200s during the 3 Kings period. It's called an intermediate period because China was 3 different nations. So, at the end of the 17th dynasty, they get together. The last king of the 17th dynasty, there was really only 3 or 4, maybe 2, I forget. He dies childless. He takes over for his father. His father starts to fight to get the Hyksos out of Egypt. He takes over for his father before he has a son, daughter, or hamster. He is killed in battle. The first king of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose, finishes kicking out the Hyksos and finishes combining. He finishes up the job. He builds a very large series of walls. The map's not up. You know how Egypt is here and it kind of goes up like this into Israel? So over here past the Nile, near the canal, what is now a canal that used to be an isthmus of Suez, he built a series of walls and fortifications and channels and anything he could do to build a wall so the Amorites could not come back. When the Amorites / Hyksos invaded, they utterly wiped out the larger Egyptian army. The Hyksos at the time had these things called chariots. Egypt had never seen them before. They were using wagons. Chariots are much faster than wagons. They can turn faster. You put an archer back there, you got some serious damage out of range. They had a better bow. Egyptians were, where there are not a lot of trees in Egypt to begin with, but the Amorites had a compound bow made out of combining wood and, it doesn't mean the same thing it means today with cams in it and shafts, and they got like those circles on the end of the bow, and you pull it back and there's a bunch of strings in there and you get an incredible, and it's a steel bow and you get an incredible amount of pull. Anyway, they had a compound bow made out of animal bone and wood. They would press it together, combine it, and do an incredibly strong bow. It went 3 times farther than the Egyptian bows of the 12th dynasty. They wiped them out. It wasn't much of a fight. The Hyksos were in charge when Joseph got here. Okay. When Joseph got to Egypt, it was a Hyksos king. And we're dating all of this date. All of this date is coming from, again, 1 Kings 6:1, where it says 480 years or 440 years before the beginning of the temple in 966 or 967. That's when they left Egypt. So using that date and using our chronologies, our lineages from the time, we can go back and figure out roughly what period of Egypt. Joseph was coming in around this time. His pharaoh was a Hyksos pharaoh. We don't know which one. After Amos here, after he comes up and retakes it, he destroys as much as he can of the history of the Hyksos. He wants nothing to be kept. Okay? So we get most of our information from southern Egypt and Josephus and people who had information from the Library of Alexandria before it was destroyed in 600 and something AD. Herodotus tells us more about the Hyksos than we learned from the Egyptians themselves, from our archaeology. They didn't like them. The Egyptians didn't like being ruled by foreigners. Imagine that, and they didn't want to write any of that down. They didn't want to record it. But that's where Joseph would have fit into. We don't know which pharaoh it was. We don't have a very good list of dates and pharaohs for this time period. We do have some names listed by Manetho, but we just can't figure out exactly when Joseph would have been in Egypt. We do know, this is key, the concept of a vizier running Egypt started in this time period. It started down here in the south, and it moved up into the north. It was the southern pharaohs who started this concept of a vizier. And what Joseph was, by the end of his life, was a vizier. He was the vizier of Egypt. That's not the word they would have used, but it is the word in English. He ran Egypt. He was second only to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh didn't have to do anything except party. As a pharaoh, I would like that arrangement. It's nice not to have to do anything but party. It pretty much describes my job right now. Anyway, so we do know that that would make sense for that time period. There are some things in Egypt. There's a canal of Joseph. It's named that. And in the Goshen lands, there's actually a town named after the Hebrews for that. During the time period when the Hebrews, so you guys all know this story. Joseph goes into Egypt as a slave, starts working for this guy named Potiphar, so righteous that he gets thrown in jail for refusing to sleep with Potiphar's wife. Well, she lied about it. Gets tossed in jail. While he's in jail, he interprets a couple of dreams. One of those guys works directly for the king. King has a dream, nobody can figure it out, and that's when he remembers Joseph. And they call on Joseph, he comes out, and he's like, oh, you're going to love this one. For 7 years, we're going to have plenty. For 7 years, we're going to have famine. So, if I were you, I'd stock up. Pharaoh goes, I like that. You're in trouble. Stock up. And that's what Joseph did. He created granaries. We actually, there is hints of this in what little we know about northern Egypt at the time. There's only hints in the records of this. Because again, those records were destroyed. If those records are still here, I firmly believe that they would show that Joseph was the vizier of Egypt for roughly 100 years. What he did was he stored up all the grain. Pharaoh bought all the grain from everybody and put it in granaries. And this is all in the Bible. So when the 7 years of famine came, he sold everybody grain. He portioned it out, sold anybody who wanted it. He had tons of grain. Because again, the Nile is the breadbasket of the world. They produce more grain than anyone else. One of the reasons they didn't like shepherds and shepherd-based peoples is because they were a grain-based economy. And if you study the American West, you know that herders, ranchers, and farmers need the same land. And only one person can use the land for one thing. You can either feed animals with it, or you can grow crops with it. You can't grow crops on the land the animals are eating off, they'll eat the crops. You could, but you're not going to get any crops, you're just going to get fat animals. Which is what the ranchers want. So think of the Israelites and the Amorites as ranchers, and the Egyptians as farmers. It'll help you out a little bit. Putting it in this time period of the 1300s BC, we have found plenty of evidence, digging near Goshen and the old city of Ramesses, we have found plenty of evidence of towns, buildings, and civilizations there that were Canaanite in origin. Okay. We even found, question? No. All right. So we found plenty of that, but according to the Egyptian chronology, it's in the wrong time for the Israelites to have been there. They say it was just some other Canaanite culture that was living there. According to the revised chronology, it matches up very well. We even found a pyramid there, a little pyramid, a little taller than me, about 8 feet high. And attached to the pyramid is a little house, and they cover this in Patterns of Evidence. It was the first time I found out about it. As soon as I read it, I paused the video as I'm watching it, go to the internet, and there's lots of evidence of this. There's a little pyramid with this little shed attached to it with a statue on it of a clearly Canaanite-style looking man with a coat of many colors on him. That's pretty cool. And then comes Moses and the 18th dynasty. It wasn't the next day, by any stretch of the imagination. But when they say that a pharaoh rose up in Egypt who did not know Joseph, they're probably talking about the 17th dynasty kicking out the Hyksos. So that's the start, arguably, of the slavery of the Israelites. They didn't want anything to do with those. And it even says in the Bible that if we go to war, who are the Egyptians most likely going to war with at this time? You go up the Mediterranean, and there's the Amorites and the Canaanites to go to war with. It says in the Bible that they're worried about the Israelites joining in the war on the other side. If they were culturally of the same, if there's culturally similar, that's a serious thing to be concerned about, because even in World War I, before we decided in World War I we were going to help the English instead of the Germans, there was a lot of support for the Germans in World War I in this nation. There was a lot of support for the Germans in World War II until we found out what they were doing. So there's a lot of German settlers in America, there's a lot of English settlers in America. It was a tough choice to decide which side to join in on. Imagine that in Egypt, where you got Israelites. Do they join the army of the Egyptians, or do they join the army of the culturally similar, who speak the same language, Canaanites? It's a legitimate concern that these pharaohs would have had. I understand why they enslaved them. I don't agree with it, but I understand why they did it. So, you're going to hear a lot of familiar names here. King Tut is one of the last kings of the 18th dynasty. He does not factor into who was, the big question is, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? People will be asking this too. Oh yeah, well who was the pharaoh? If it was Ramses, if it was Ramses, then the whole time thing's off. And it is, we covered that. But most people think it was Ramses because they were living in the town of Ramses. It wasn't Ramesses. So, let me tell you what happens with these guys. Amos finishes kicking them out, builds the Maginot Line. You guys know what the Maginot Line was? Look it up. So, it's a great reference. If you don't get it, you'll look it up and you'll be like, I get it. Then we start with the Amenhoteps and the Thutmoses. Amenhotep, this is a rebuilding period. Amos and Amenhotep are rebuilding periods. Amenhotep first. These dates aren't quite right, by the way. Believe it or not, Wikipedia gets things wrong. Amos and Amenhotep are rebuilding the nation. It is Thutmose I who has imperial designs. He decides, okay, I need you to swap over to the other map, the map of the Middle East, please. We're going to be going back and forth a little bit. So, Thutmose I decides he wants an empire. Looking around, he said, well, that's a little dry. There's some stuff down there, but the Nubians are great warriors. I owe them some, we kind of owe these people a little bit. Let's see if we can push up into here. Remember I told you the Euphrates was going to be a big deal? Thutmose I's goal for his empire was to get to the Euphrates River. That was his goal. The Euphrates River is the point that they were yelling about that the Mitanni and the Hittites are fighting over. Okay? So he pushes up through here, easily takes, and remember, the Israelites are living here, right about there. He easily conquers all this territory on the way up to there. Nobody's fighting over it. The two biggest cities were destroyed in the time, the five biggest cities were destroyed by God in the time. By the way, Santorini, Greece, the volcano that explodes in Santorini, Greece, actually matches up as almost the same year and in the same time that Abraham was in there. Crete, Santorini, and Sodom and Gomorrah, where he dug up, all show signs of similar destruction from landfall from that explosion, from that volcanic eruption. It could have been the Santorini eruption that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It's well within the range. That was a big one. Mount St. Helens was nothing. Santorini, Greece exploding was huge. If you've ever seen the island, which I have not, but I've seen pictures, it wrecked. I mean, you've got like half a volcano left. That's it. Pretty neat. Neat place to visit. Bill Cosby describes it pretty well in one of his. What?
And that volcano is top left of the map, the lower Greece.
Around this area?
Okay.
Yeah. Because this is Crete, and one of the cities in Crete here was destroyed by the volcano. But it could have hit. It is possible for it to have come down here and hit down there. It would have taken an act of God to direct it just that perfectly. And I'm going to just go on. There's no cities here. This is the most fertile part of, at the time, this is the most fertile part of the Levant. And everybody was building here. In fact, at Stephen Collins' dig site, he has found evidence of the Minoan civilization. That's the city of Minos, or Minoa, or whatever it's called, on Crete. There was evidence of Greek civilization here. And the practice of taking a boy when he's 12 years old and turning him into a homosexual lover for a 22-year-old, which was practiced at Santorini, practiced in Crete, on the island of Crete, and we have evidence that it was practiced at Sodom and Gomorrah. If that dig site is Sodom and Gomorrah, which I firmly believe it is, as it is exactly where the Bible said it was, and there's no other evidence of any other cities that big at the time. If you listen to one of Stephen Collins' lectures, he will go into a lot of detail on it. I got 35 minutes left. I'm going to leave you with that for Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to go back to Moses' time period here. There's nothing here with Thutmose I. There's some little cities, little towns. He walks right through, goes right up to the border there, fights the Mitanni, takes it. Now the Mitanni and the Hittites are fighting back and forth over this. So he doesn't face the Mitanni army, he just faces who's there from the Mitanni, the guards from the Mitanni army. He leaves. He sets up some guards of his own. Everybody now has to pay him tribute. They're going to pay it in wine and olive oil, because the best wine and olive oil in the Mediterranean come from Lebanon and Israel. Okay? So he's going to come down from there, go back to Egypt to rule, and as soon as he leaves, the Mitanni show up and say, what do you mean you guys are now vassals of Egypt? You were kidding, right? You're really still vassals of the Mitanni, right? And they all went, well, your swords are a lot bigger than ours, and you have an army, and we're just some farmers and whatnot, and traders. I think you're right. We were just kidding with the Egyptians. Yep, not a problem. We'll pay you instead of them until they come back. Then we'll pay them if you're not here. Is that okay with you? Maybe we won't tell you that, but that's what happened. The people who were living there didn't care as long as they got left alone. They would pay tribute to whoever as long as they weren't killed. They weren't a great army, they weren't great warriors. They were not in a position to build an army to face the second most powerful nation in the world, the Mitanni, or the most powerful nation in the world, Egypt. We go back to the other page, please. Keep that map in your head. I'm not going to make it switch every 2 seconds when they go to the Kingpin area. Scroll down a little bit. We're going to do the Thutmoses now. Okay. Hatshepsut. No, up. I want Thutmose the first at the top. No, right there. Perfect. So these three Thutmoses are the three pharaohs. Thutmose the first, Thutmose the second, Thutmose the third. These guys are important, and they kicked a lot of butt, especially Thutmose the third. So, Thutmose the first had no sons with his queen. He had sons, but he didn't have any sons with his queen. And that's important. If he doesn't have a son with his queen, he has to find some way else to pass on the dynasty. And it has to be through the queen. That's important. He has a daughter named Hatshepsut. She marries her stepbrother, Thutmose II. Now, I think these dates are a little off, but they're not a lot off. Thutmose II, as you can see, ruled from 93 to 79. That's only like 12 years, all said and done. 12, 13, 14 years. That's a very short reign. We're not saying that she poisoned him, but some people did say she may have poisoned him, so she could reign on her own. Hatshepsut should have been pharaoh. She was the oldest daughter. They didn't do female pharaohs then. We don't even do female kings and queens too often now. Elizabeth II is one of the 4 female queens of England. There's only been 4. Who ruled? There's been plenty of other queens, just not queens who ruled. Her son is her stepson. Again, Thutmose II has a kid with one of his concubines slash lesser wives slash woman he met on the street. I don't know. Thutmose III is born. He becomes the crown prince while Hatshepsut is alive as a placeholder. She's going to have a kid. She's going to have a son. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Arguably, depending on the time, the third would be Moses' half-brother, stepbrother, adopted brother. I'm confused. Now this is important. If she was Moses' mom, these following events are important. She may not have been. And we don't know. The time, because the time frames are kind of wacky, there's some give and take here. I still need Hatshepsut. If you can scroll up just a little bit. Or down. Yeah, Hatshepsut here. Okay. Thutmose II dies. Thutmose III is a kid. He's like 6 or 8 years old. Very, very young. He is now pharaoh. They throw her in the rulers list here because she ruled Egypt. She claimed to be pharaoh. Thutmose III is still the crown prince. He's 8 years old, roughly. She sends him off to run the military up at the top of the Levant. Thutmose III spent his childhood as the commander of the armies of Egypt fighting the Mitanni and the Hittites and anybody who rebelled against them in the Levant. From the age of 8 to 24, he learned how to be the baddest bad. I'm just talking about Shaq, baby. He's the baddest. Just talking about Shaq, baby. He is the baddest guy around, this guy right here. Okay, he can defeat anyone. He is a military genius, and he gets that way from fighting for 16 years of his life, from 8 to 24. During those 16 years, Hatshepsut rules Egypt. She was a trader, not a fighter. She did not declare war on anyone during her entire reign. These were territorial disputes that Thutmose III is fighting. She is trading all over the Mediterranean seas. She is trading from Egypt all the way around the horn of the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to, we don't know how far it went. We know it went down the coast of Africa. It may have gone all the way out over to India. She was a trader. I don't mean that in like betrayer. I mean, she traded. She was a merchant queen. She brought in a lot of money to Egypt, and Egypt has the biggest gold mines in the world at the time. On the Sinai Peninsula, a lot of them were. She enriched Egypt greatly during her 16 years of reign. I'm 24 years old. Thutmose III says to himself, I'm lying here in a tent by the Euphrates River, fighting a whole bunch of people. My dad was pharaoh long before this. Long before he was 24 years old. Why am I sleeping in a tent when my stepmother, my wicked stepmother, is living in a palace in Egypt. What is going on here? So he takes his army and he goes back to Egypt. And he takes the throne. Hatshepsut, we don't know what happens to her. It is not recorded what happens to her. If I had to have a guess, I think he killed his mom. If I was him, and I wanted to secure the throne, and I was an evil person, I would kill my mom. I can't even imagine killing my mom, that's all. But she wasn't his mom, she was his stepmom. This is not the woman who gave him birth. He probably killed her, he may have just exiled her. Either way, he defaced all of her statues and erased her history from the books. They just chipped those stones away. Whatever she wrote on stone, gone. Let's get rid of it. Who's got a chisel? I need someone with a chisel. And off they went. If Moses could have been, this is theory, conjecture, may or may not be true. If Moses was, not Thutmose, but Moses, if Moses was Hatshepsut's, it may be pretty easy to pronounce when you're looking at it, but off the top of your tongue as you're talking, it trips me up. If he was her son, he may have been being groomed to be king of Egypt. After she's left, his going down to join with the Israelites and kills an Egyptian who's whipping or beating an Israelite or whatever that situation was, as recorded in Exodus, may have been his attempt to start rallying the incredibly large Israelite population in Egypt to his side to make a bid for the throne. Paul tells us that Moses wanted to use his political power to do something good for his people. To liberate his people. That's a paraphrase. You can go and I forget what book it is in the New Testament, but Paul talks about it. That could have been his attempt. If this is a situation, if this matches up with the timeline properly, which again it goes back to 1 Kings 6:1, as to whether it was that 40 years difference there makes a huge difference. So yeah, that could have been what Moses was doing. After he kills the Egyptian and is found out about it, he has to go. Because if Thutmose III is on the throne, if Thutmose III is his brother of sorts, Thutmose III has already gotten rid of his mother, his adopted mother. Thutmose III is probably looking to get for a way to get rid of Moses himself. That would make a lot of sense. Is that necessarily what happened? I don't know. Moses was 40 years old at the time. That would make him older than Thutmose III, but it fits. It fits the timeline. He would be Thutmose III's older brother, but he wasn't the crown prince. That fits the 480s from the Masoretic text very well. It does not fit the 440 from the Septuagint text very well. So, moving on. Either way, Thutmose III was almost definitely the pharaoh that Moses lived under when he was in Egypt. Whether it was his brother or a cousin or whatever, it was almost definitely an uncle, it was almost definitely him. Because the Exodus happens sometime in the reign, at the end of Amenhotep II's reign or the end of Thutmose IV's reign. But he only reigned for 10 years, less really. About 9, most people think. But if it happened at the death of him or the death of him. I think it's the death of him. Stephen Collins thinks it's the death of Thutmose IV. I think it's the death of Amenhotep II. I think it's that because Thutmose IV was not the crown prince of Egypt. There's a lot of problems in this dynasty. He was of blood. There's a lot of problems in this dynasty at this time period, starting after Thutmose I, of having sons with the right woman. Maybe they stopped having sons with all these other women, but whatever. Thutmose IV was not only not the son of Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II's son died before Thutmose IV took the throne. Some people think it was political intrigue. We don't know. But we do know from the Bible that Pharaoh's son was killed on the 10th plague, his firstborn son, and the Pharaoh was killed shortly after that when he died in the Red Sea. Okay. there's what's called the dream stele, or stele, S-T-E-L-E. People pronounce it differently. No one pronounces it Stella! Well, the older people got the joke. What is that? Streetcar Named Desire. It's a Tennessee Williams play. There's an episode of The Simpsons where they turned it into a musical. It's hilarious. Can't you hear me yell, Stella, I'm your fella, Stella, Stella. Anyway, that's the role that made, what's his name, Godfather there, famous.
Marlon Brando.
Who?
Marlon Brando.
Marlon Brando, thank you, yes. So, the Stella, or Stele, or Stele, or whatever it's pronounced, it was at the foot of the Sphinx. When they dug up the Sphinx, they found the stele. It's called the Dream Stele. It is a record that Thutmose the Force had, Thutmose the Force be with you. When Thutmose, the Fourth, he had a dream. He was dreaming underneath the Sphinx. And he had a dream given to him by the gods. Personally, I think it was PR. And his dream stated that if he dug out the Sphinx, he would be Pharaoh. That's it. The real Pharaoh was dead. The crown prince was dead, arguably in a very short period of time. Whether he killed them or they were the ones who died in the Exodus, Thutmose IV claims the throne. He has the next best claim on the throne. No historian's arguing that. But he wasn't supposed to be Pharaoh, and that's a big deal. So, that's why I think it happened at the end of Amenhotep II's reign, and Thutmose IV was the next Pharaoh in line. It could have been, Stephen Collins argues that it is Thutmose IV who dies. He's got the timeline set a whole lot better than me. You studied this a lot. I've studied it a little bit. There's another name. I want you guys to Google this guy. I highly recommend, I give you guys free resources all the time. I highly recommend you look up this man's YouTube channel. I pull a lot of stuff from him. I don't agree with him on this, but he only uses he doesn't even mention the difference between the Masoretic and the Septuagint. He just goes with Masoretic. His name is Bruce Gore. He has 37 Bible study sections he did in Sunday school at his church out near Seattle. And he covers in 37 sessions from creation to the cross. They're about 45 minutes apiece. You're not going to watch them in one night. You might watch one a night. You might watch one a week. He did these one a week, stopping for Christmas and summer break and all the stuff we always stop for, and most churches do. But he does a great job of explaining it. I don't agree with him on every point, but if you just want a good, solid overview explained by an easygoing teacher, more in depth than I can do in two-hour sessions, highly recommend watching through these videos. It'll give you a good sense of what's going on. So, let's scroll down here. So this is the Exodus. It's either the end of Amenhotep II or the beginning or the end of Thutmose IV. Keep going down. Keep going down a little bit. Okay, stop. After Thutmose IV, we start getting into the Amenhoteps. We have Amenhotep III, who only reigned for, so that was like 9 years. This is, of Joshua's time period. When Joshua entered the land. Do you have a question? I can answer. No? Okay. Yeah, do you?
No, I kept on looking at all the years and I was getting confused with because it's BC, so it's going towards.
It's going toward the cross. It's going backwards.
I was like, but yeah.
Yeah. Don't worry, it screws me up a lot too. So, Akhenaten was probably the pharaoh during the time of Joshua when he entered the land, when the Israelites took the land. He gets a lot of letters, so he's still... Egypt is destroyed. The reason why we know Thutmose III was not the pharaoh of the Exodus, but probably was the pharaoh that Moses lived under, is because you can watch the power of the land, how powerful the land is by the records. And Thutmose III is the most powerful pharaoh in the history of the world. Okay? He rules more land, he has more gold, he has trade with more nations. Remember how I told you his mommy there, his wicked stepmother, how she did trade? She brought in more wealth to Egypt than Thutmose III did in the same period, in the same amount of time. But Thutmose III inherited all that when he got rid of mommy, when he threw mama from a train, or whatever he did. Thutmose III was the most powerful pharaoh in the history of Egypt, bar none. His son, Amenhotep II, people argue he was more powerful, but Thutmose is the one who put it all together. Under Thutmose II, they made a treaty with the Mitanni that the land would pay tribute, that the whole part where the Euphrates touches the Mediterranean, or almost touches the Mediterranean there, they wrote the very first treaty that we have recorded in the history of the world. They say it was Ramesses II who wrote the first treaty, and when we found the treaty written by Ramesses II, it was the oldest treaty. But since then, we've done more digging. This is the first treaty that we know of in the history of the world. Here are the terms basically of the treaty. The people of that small little area there at the Euphrates River, they would pay their tribute to the Egyptians. The Mitanni would have free access to the Mediterranean, and the Mitanni were in charge of defending that territory from anyone besides the Mitanni and the Egyptians. Isn't that a pretty good deal? We don't have to kill each other anymore. And we don't have to kill each other anymore. We get the tribute. Egypt gets the tribute, and Egypt gets the fame. The Mitanni get the access, which is all they wanted. Egypt in turn gives them gold. They give them a certain amount of gold every year. But Egypt's got lots of gold, and they're actually paying less than they would be paying for the tribute that they were getting in wine and olive oil than they would be paying if they were paying fair market prices. So it's a win-win-win-win-win-win deal all around. First trade treaty, first end of a war treaty that we know. But if we keep digging, we might find something else. Akhenaten is getting letters, so he still has control over the Levant. It is a nominal control. The army of Egypt was destroyed in the Red Sea. What God did with the 10 plagues utterly destroyed Egypt at least for the next 40 years. If you read through the promises made in the book of made to Abraham and continually made to the Jews throughout the Deuteronomy and up through Judges, God promises to give them the land of, and there's a variety of people. The Egyptians are not mentioned once. There is no significant Egyptian presence in the Levant when Joshua goes into it. There is a nominal Egyptian presence. And these letters prove it. They're called the Amarna letters. Akhenaten moved the capital of Egypt to Amarna. He went to monotheism. He renamed himself Akhenaten instead of Amenhotep IV. Aten was the name of the god. Akhenaten means like son of Aten or something like that. I don't know. But he moved the capital to Amarna. He got a whole bunch of letters there. Those letters are written in Akkadian. It was the English of the world at the time. Everybody in the world, if you speak English almost anywhere in the world, someone around you is probably going to understand it. You can thank the English for that. America never really had an empire if you wanted to plan an empire in any reasonable way, but the English sure did, and it was all over the world. The lingua franca of the world today, which ironically means, anyway. The language of the world back then was Akkadian. These letters are written in Akkadian, we can read Akkadian. I can't, but other people can. And they basically say, help, the Habiru are attacking us. We need you to come into Egypt and bring your armies and destroy the Habiru. Please come fight the Habiru. All the different kings of the Levant are writing to Akhenaten at Amarna, hence the Amarna letters. Please come save us from the Habiru. Please come save us. I'm sorry, Hapiru. It's a P. H-A-P. I'll write it down. I like that. H-A-P-I-R-U. Hapiru. Hapiru. Hebrew. We cannot guarantee that this is where the root of the word Hebrew comes from. No one knows what the root of the word Hebrew is. Nobody. Nobody knows. It is not an Israelite word. It is not a Hebrew word, ironically enough. The word Hebrew is not of Hebrew origins. It is some other people group. It is a name from another language. We don't know which one. This is our best bet. Hapiru. Hapiru was a word in Akkadian that referred to the transient gangs and pirate gangs and what you want to call them, brigands, who lived outside the cities. They were people who lived outside the cities who attempted to raid the cities. Doesn't that kind of sound like the Israelites during Joshua coming in? That's what I would call it. That's the word I had for brigands who are raiding my cities. In my language, that is definitely the word I would use to describe the Hebrews at the time. Hapiru. That's how I usually say it because it's easy to spell that way. Ha-Pi-Ru. So they're writing letters to Akhenaten. Akhenaten doesn't write back. He doesn't have an army. Question?
Where is he? Is he still in Egypt?
He's in Egypt, moved the capital from up near the top of the Nile down into southern Egypt. It was a much more protected place.
He's getting all these letters from all these
From
different...
all these vassals, these people were technically part of his empire. But it's an empire he can't defend. He doesn't have an army. At the same time, he's getting letters from the Mitanni, who he has that treaty with. Mitanni are like, hey, where's our gold? You owe us gold. You promised us gold. Where's our gold? We'd like our gold. Can we have our gold? We want our gold. Can we have our gold? Where's our gold? I want some gold. They're not getting their shipments. Egypt, during the reign of these two pharaohs, is in a state of disarray. So, Akhenaten dies. This is, again, roughly when the Israelites are coming into the land. It's during the reign of Akhenaten. Scroll down, so this picture goes away. Okay. You see, you know, I said most of them are very easy to pronounce. I got nothing on this guy. Smenkhkarakari.
Why don't they just call them Smed back in the day or something?
They do it in every other language. Like, you know, trying to think. Russians actually tend to use the last part of your name and add "ya" to it. So they don't use the first part of your name. They use the last part of your name for nicknames. So, like, and my first name is Jerry. So in English, I'm Jer. Hey, Jer, how you doing, Jer? Most people use my last name as a nickname. It's Beasley. They call me Bees. Bees, how you doing, Bees? Bees, Killer Bees, how you doing, Bees? Bees, what's up, Bees? Bees, how you doing? I should produce honey. So anyway, as in Russia, my nickname would be Ria. Jerry Ria. That's just weird. One of the guys at work is Russian. He goes, in Russia, your nickname would be. And then I looked it up. He told me about it and I had to verify. It's like an obsession. Anyway. Yeah, they probably called him Smith. This guy ruled just long enough to almost be argued over whether he ruled at all. I mean, his date is 335 to 334. We're talking months. That's not 2 years, that's months. The next ruler is Tutankhamun. You can see that because it says Nefertiti here. I know her. We mostly call her Nefertiti. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. Well, why not? Neferu-Aten. Notice the Aten, like Akhenaten? Tutankhamun is the son of Akhenaten. Tutankhamun is the crown prince through all of this. When Akhenaten dies, first there's a viceroy, Smed, and then Nefertiti takes over. Tutankhamun, he rules for 32 to 23. It's about 18 years. He started ruling when he was an infant, hence why these other two are in the list. I don't know who Smed was, could have been his uncle. There's almost no records of this guy. Nefertiti takes over, she rules for, so her reign dates here are 34 to 32, are actually part of his reign. Like those, technically, he was pharaoh, she was viceroy, or vizier. Does that make sense? Okay. At the death of Tutankhamun, we get a very interesting point in world history, and we get to meet my favorite name of all time. I'm sorry, of this time period, not of all time. Does everybody have down Bruce Gore? Everybody have down Hapiru if you want it? Definitely watch that Bruce Gore stuff. Again, I don't agree with him with everything. He is an old Earth creationist. I'm a young Earth creationist. I've really only affected the second video. where he talks about the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation record. Is it Babylon? I think it's Babylon. One of those ancient cultures' creation record. If you were in the creation class, I mentioned it, it echoes the Israeli account. It's similar, but very different. Supi Luli Umis. Spelled just like it sounds. Su, Pi, Lu, Li, U, Mas. Supi Luli Umis. Bruce Gore pronounces it differently. I pronounce it that way, so I will always remember how to spell it. Su, Pi, Lu, Li, U, Mas. This is the most powerful man in the world at the time of his death. He is the king of the Hittites. Remember how I told you the Mitanni were the second most powerful nation? Now, the treaty has only been going on for a couple decades at this point. 40 years, like they were wandering in the desert or something. The Hittites are still fighting the Mitanni to get access to that land. Egypt is considered the most powerful army in the world, but it's not. It is utterly destroyed. Has been for 40 years now. Thutmose III was incredibly powerful. At the end of his son reigns, Amenhotep II, Egypt falls into a state of disarray for no reason whatsoever. There was no civil war, there was no external war, there was no reason for it to fall into disarray. The Nile was still flooding regularly. By all accounts, there's no reason for Egypt to have fallen. But Egypt fell, and it fell hard. These two guys are fighting. Suppiluliumis comes to the throne. Suppiluliumis is a name you want to remember because he was awesome. Suppiluliumis calls up the Assyrians. Now, a couple hundred years earlier, or 100 years earlier, whatever it was, the Assyrians went and decided to sack Babylon, the largest empire in the world at the time, wiped them out. It was a fun thing to do. Gets in contact with the Assyrians. Assyria is in here somewhere. That's a 100-mile odd circle, so I'll just let it go with that. I don't remember exactly. They're on the Euphrates River at Assyria. Up here in the middle, you have the Mitanni, and then the Hittites. Suppiluliumis calls up, does a little video chat with the Assyrian leader, whose name I don't know. Says, hey, you attack them from the west, you come at them from the west, we'll attack east, and we'll take out the Mitanni. And it worked. They slaughtered the Mitanni. The Mitanni are gone and off the picture. Gone. One campaign, gone. The Assyrians go back to their city. It was a fun thing to do. The Hittites take most of the Mitanni land, starting the Hittite Empire. That includes this little piece of real estate where the Euphrates almost touches the Mediterranean. Or does touch. I forget. We could blow it up and look, but who cares? I only have 5 minutes. Suppiluliumis is now thinking about attacking Egypt, but he thinks Egypt is strong. But he gets a letter. Tutankhamun was killed. We have no doubt about that. He's got a big hole in the back of his skull that would fit a pickaxe pretty well. He's about 18, 20 years old. His wife sends a letter to Suppiluliumis. When we found the Hittite tomb, we found a Rosetta Stone for the Hittites, and some Harry Winkler. It wasn't Henry Winkler, that's the Collins. Hey! But it was Winkler. I think it was Harry Winkler, Harold. Anyway, go. Suppiluliumis.
Suppiluliumis.
Yeah.
Does he, yeah.
He's what?
Who is he the leader of?
He's the king of the Hittites. He's the king of the Hittites. And this is big stuff right here. So the wife of Tutankhamun writes a letter to Suppiluliumis and says, my husband has died, we have no sons. You have lots of sons. Send me one of your sons. I'll marry him, and he will be king of Egypt. It is recorded in the records from the Hittites that Suppiluliumis was going, I've never seen anything like this before. What is the trick here? What are they trying to pull? What's going on? This is insane. Why would the Egyptians be writing to me to have a son? There's plenty of other Egyptians she could marry. What is going on here? He doesn't know. Egypt has fallen. It fell 40 years ago, 50 years ago. He doesn't know. He thinks Egypt is still an incredibly powerful nation. So, he thinks it over, he sends a delegation to Egypt. They sit down with the queen. Queen sends them back with another letter. What are you thinking, Soupy? I need a husband. I wasn't kidding. Who else am I going to appeal to here? It's you or nobody. I need a boy. I need a man. I need a man now. I need a man. Right now, send me a son, and Egypt will be yours to rule. She's giving him Egypt. It was the best move she could make at the time. Didn't work. The next guy on the list after Tutankhamun, or the guy after him, the son gets to the border of Egypt and is assassinated. The guy who comes, yeah, those two, and Horem. It was Horemheb probably. He only ruled for 4 years, and he put him on the throne. Horemheb probably also killed Ai, by the way. He killed a lot of people. He was a general. He was part of the Pharaoh's family. And I got to finish up here with Suppiluliumus. So, this is one of the only proofs we have that Egypt is still dealing with plague. Suppiluliumus already owns part of Syria and Lebanon. He took it when he took the Mitanni lands. After they assassinate his son, Suppiluliumus is mad. He assembles an incredibly large army, probably the largest one in the world at the time, and he decides to walk through the Levant and take Egypt. He doesn't get too far, because as soon as he starts taking northern Egyptian towns, everybody gets the plague. Various plagues. Suppiluliumus dies of that plague. And this is 40, 50 years after we assume the Exodus happened, based off of the date of the temple. And 1 Kings 6:1, whichever translation you use. Suppiluliumus dies of plague. Egypt does not recover until Ramses II, which is 3 kings into the 19th dynasty. Horemheb is the last king of the 18th dynasty. His vizier is Ramses I. Ramses was not his birth name, it was the name he took to solidify the fact that he had been the son of Ra. Now he's the son of Ra, he's taken over. Ramses again means